At some point, someone told you that you think too much, too sensitive, too scattered, too hard to keep up with. And the strange part, you never fully disagreed. Some part of you quietly accepted it, filed it away, moved on. But here is what that person did not know, and what you may not know either. Several of the traits that get described as problems, the restlessness, the intensity, the inability to just leave things alone, appear with unusual consistency in research on people who go on to produce genuinely original work, not as myths, as documented patterns. Today, we are looking at 6 of them. The 6th one is the one most people spend their entire lives feeling without ever finding a name for it. Here is something most people get wrong about creative genius. They picture someone who always had the answers, confident, consistent, the person everyone already knew would do something remarkable. But researchers who study the actual documented lives of people who changed their fields, not the myths, the real records, keep finding something that does not match that picture. Restlessness, academic inconsistency, a tendency to wander across subjects, a persistent feeling that the way everyone around them was thinking about something was slightly off. Many of them were told to focus, settle down, pick a lane. They did not, and that refusal, the thing that looked like a flaw, turned out to be structurally connected to the thing that made their work impossible to replicate. Imagine trying to explain a color to someone who has only ever read about colors in books. You know exactly what it looks like. The problem is not the knowing. The problem is finding words that carry it accurately to someone else. For some people, this is not a hypothetical. This is how thinking works. Understanding arrives as something visual first, a shape, a structure, a spatial relationship the mind examines before it becomes language. The translation into words comes second, and that gap between what is already clear internally and what language can carry is something many people with this pattern spend years misreading as a personal limitation. Psychologist Howard Gardner identified spatial reasoning as a distinct cognitive mode, largely invisible to standard educational measurement. Research suggests it appears often in people whose work involves building things that did not previously exist. The difficulty was never the thinking, it was the translation, and those are not the same problem. In one study on creative professionals, a significant portion reported that their most important ideas came not during focused work, but during unrelated activities, walking, showering, lying awake before sleep. This is not a coincidence, and it is not laziness. In 1908, Henri Poincaré had been stuck on a problem for weeks. The moment he stepped onto a bus, not thinking, not trying, the answer arrived. Fully formed. He wrote about it with genuine bewilderment, but what he experienced has since been documented across many fields of creative work. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi found a consistent rhythm in many of the highly creative individuals he studied: intense engagement, then stillness, then an answer that felt like it came from nowhere, but only because the work that produced it was invisible. If your best thinking tends to arrive when you stop pushing for it, you are not avoiding the work. In many cases, the not trying is part of the process. The silence you have felt guilty about may be something your mind actually needs. What is a question you have never been able to fully leave alone? Not a practical question, not something with an obvious answer, something that keeps coming back, an angle on something, a problem most people around you seem to have already settled, and you cannot close it. For 10 years, Albert Einstein returned to a question most physicists considered barely worth engaging. What would happen if you chased a beam of light? It sounded naive, almost childish. He kept asking it anyway, and his refusal to accept the question as settled contributed to a fundamental restructuring of how physics understands space and time. Research on creative thinking has identified something called problem finding, the tendency to notice that a question itself may be incorrectly framed before attempting to answer it. Studies suggest this capacity appears more often in people who go on to produce original work compared to people who are primarily skilled at answering questions as they are given. The question you keep returning to, the one that feels hard to justify, impractical, slightly embarrassing to admit you still think about, may not be a distraction. In some cases, it's where the real work begins. This one is different from the others. Think back, not to your achievements, but to the moments when someone communicated, in words or without them, that you were too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too intense about other people moved past without a second thought, too many questions, too difficult to be around when you were fully yourself.
If you recognize that, there is a good chance you learn to manage it. Not dramatically, slowly, over years. You learn to feel things less visibly, to say less, to arrive at conversations already edited, already a smaller version of yourself, so the room stayed comfortable. And here is the part that is difficult to sit with. It worked. You got better at it. You became easier to be around, and somewhere in that process, access to something was quietly lost. Not permanently, but the habit of making yourself smaller does not stop on its own. It continues until something interrupts it. Psychologist Kazimir Dabrowski studied this pattern in gifted and creative individuals. His research suggests that the same intensities that made certain people too much in early environments were, in many cases, connected to the depth of perception that made their later work distinctive. The sensitivity was not the problem. The sensitivity was the instrument, and at some point, you were taught to put it down. There is a kind of intelligence that does not show up on any standard test. It is the ability to walk into a situation and see, almost immediately, the structure underneath it. Not the surface, the incentives, the pressure points, the place where something is already beginning to fail, even when everything still looks stable. Research describes this as systems thinking. It is associated with people whose work involves redesigning how things function, rather than simply operating within existing structures. It tends to make certain things easier, seeing through manipulation, recognizing patterns before they fully emerge, understanding why a problem keeps returning, even after it appears to have been solved. But it carries something else with it that doesn't get mentioned as often. It means you are rarely fully inside an experience, while others are simply in the moment. Part of you is already outside it, watching the mechanics, mapping the architecture, noticing how it is likely to end. You are present, but never entirely there. That is a specific kind of distance. And if you have lived with it long enough, you probably already know that trying to explain it to someone who doesn't share it tends to make the distance feel wider. This is the one most people don't say out loud. Not because they don't feel it, because saying it requires admitting something that is hard to frame without sounding ungrateful. It's a low, quiet discomfort that shows up not when things are going badly, but when things are going fine, when life is stable, when there is nothing obviously wrong, when you have, by most reasonable measures, enough, and something is still unsettled. You've probably tried to reason past it, told yourself to be grateful, reminded yourself that other people manage contentment with far less, that whatever this feeling is, it reflects poorly on you. Abraham Maslow, late in his career, observed something in people who had already achieved recognition and continued creating anyway, not for external reasons, but because stopping seemed to produce its own internal friction. His observations suggested that for some people, generative activity functions less like a goal and more like a need, and its absence brings a pressure that doesn't respond to rest or comfort or telling yourself you should be satisfied. One way to understand that feeling, not as a certainty but as a possibility, is that it may be a sign of a mind that has not yet found the conditions it needs to do what it is capable of. That restlessness is not ingratitude, and it's not a character flaw. It may simply be information. Sit with that for a moment. The sensitivity you learned to manage, the questions you were told were impractical, the silence between bursts of work that felt like failure, the intensity that made rooms uncomfortable, the distance that kept you from ever fully arriving anywhere. Research doesn't promise that recognizing these patterns leads to any specific outcome. It doesn't guarantee anything. What it does suggest is that these traits, the ones that looked like problems, are connected to the same psychological architecture that makes certain kinds of original work possible. You don't need anyone's permission to take that seriously, but you may need to stop waiting for it. None of these 6 patterns tend to look like strengths while you're living inside them. Spatial thinking looks like struggling to explain yourself. Incubation looks like avoidance. The question you can't leave alone looks like impracticality. Emotional depth looks like instability. Systems thinking looks like overcomplicating what everyone else accepts. And a restless, generative mind looks, from the outside, like someone who has never learned to be satisfied. Most of these have probably been used as criticisms at some point by someone else, or quietly, by you. This is not self-help. This is self-understanding. If one of these 6 landed somewhere specific, you already know which one, and you already know what it means.